Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going deep on a question that has sparked debate for centuries. What did Jesus really look like? And why does it even matter? We've got some really fascinating sources lined up for this deep dive. Biblical passages, historical accounts, theological discussions, even some pop culture references. You ready to go deep?
I am. It's a question that goes beyond just physical appearance, though. What's so fascinating is how the image of Jesus has been shaped by cultural and political forces throughout history, reflecting the power dynamics of the time. For example, early Christians actually avoided creating physical depictions of Jesus altogether, especially during the Roman Empire.
Well, that's interesting. Why would they avoid depicting him?
There was a strong concern about idolatry, which was strictly prohibited in their faith. They believed that creating images could lead to the worship of the image itself rather than the divine.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it also makes you wonder, doesn't it? Because when you close your eyes and picture Jesus, what do you see? I'm betting most people, even without realizing it, picture a very specific image. The European look with blonde hair and blue eyes.
And that's not a coincidence. That image is a relatively recent development, heavily influenced by the art and power dynamics of Europe, especially during periods like the Renaissance. The dominance of this white Jesus image aligns closely with the era of European colonialism and the spread of Western Christianity throughout the world.
So the image of Jesus we're so familiar with today might actually be more about European influence than historical accuracy.
Exactly. It raises important questions about how power and cultural dominance shape our perceptions, even our perceptions of religious figures.
Okay, so we've got this dominant image of a white Jesus, but the Bible itself seems to paint a different picture, right?
Absolutely. If we go back to the source material, the Bible actually gives us some pretty specific details about Jesus' appearance, and they might surprise you.
Okay, spill the tea. What does the Bible actually say?
Well, in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 14, John describes Jesus' hair as being white as wool. And just a few verses later, his feet are described as like burnished bronze.
Wool and burnished bronze. That's a far cry from the typical flowing blonde hair and fair skin we see in most depictions.
Right. These descriptions challenge the traditional image quite directly. Wool, as we know, has a very distinct texture. It's not typically associated with the straight flowing hair often depicted in images of white Jesus. And burnished bronze suggests a darker, more metallic hue, which again contrasts with lighter skin tones.
So if we're taking the Bible literally, the image of a white Jesus doesn't really hold up.
Not necessarily. Interpretations can vary, and there's certainly room for different perspectives. But those biblical descriptions, at the very least, open up the possibility of imagining Jesus in a way that's quite different from the dominant image we've inherited.
And we have to consider the context too, right? Jesus wasn't European. He lived in Judea, which is part of the Roman Empire, but located in the Middle East.
Precisely. And Judea in the first century was incredibly diverse, a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities. People from all over the Roman Empire, including those with African, Middle Eastern, and European descent, lived and traveled through the region.
So it stands to reason that Jesus, living in such a diverse region, might have looked very different from the way he's often portrayed.
It's certainly a possibility worth considering, and it challenges the notion that Christianity, even from its earliest days, was a solely European religion.
And speaking of challenging notions, there are some interesting biblical connections to Africa that are often overlooked. For instance, the story of the Ethiopian eunuch's conversion to Christianity in the book of Acts.
That's a fascinating story. It highlights early Christianity's reach into Africa and suggests that the faith was embraced by people of diverse backgrounds right from the start. This eunuch was a high-ranking official from a powerful African kingdom, and he took the message of Christianity back to his homeland, demonstrating the faith's early presence and impact in Africa.
And it's not just that one story, right? There's also the ancient translation of the Bible into Ge'ez, the liturgical language of Ethiopia.
Absolutely. The fact that the Bible was translated into Ge'ez in the 5th century speaks volumes about the commitment of Ethiopian Christians to preserving and spreading the scriptures in their own language. It showcases the deep roots of Christianity in Africa, going back centuries.
So even the early centuries of Christianity, we see evidence of its presence and influence in Africa, challenging the idea that it was solely a European religion.
Exactly, and it reinforces the importance of looking beyond the dominant narratives and exploring the diverse ways in which Christianity has been experienced and expressed throughout history and across cultures.
Okay, so we've talked about the biblical descriptions of Jesus and the early spread of Christianity into Africa. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how early Christians represented Jesus visually before those more realistic depictions started to emerge.
Before physical depictions became common, early Christians relied heavily on symbols to represent Jesus and their faith.
What kind of symbols are we talking about?
Think of the fish, for instance.
The ichthyes.
Exactly. The ichthyes or fish symbol was a secret sign used by early Christians to identify one another during times of persecution. Or the image of the Good Shepherd, which symbolized Jesus' role as a protector and guide for his followers. These symbols carried powerful meaning and allowed early Christians to express their faith without resorting to direct physical portrayals of Jesus.
But eventually those physical depictions did start to appear, right?
Yes, but it wasn't until later centuries that we start to see more realistic depictions of Jesus in art. This shift was driven in part by changes in artistic trends and the evolving relationship between Christianity and political power.
So what kind of art influenced those early depictions of Jesus?
Byzantine and Roman art played a significant role. These artistic styles carried certain aesthetic conventions that influenced how Jesus was portrayed, from his clothing to his facial features.
And this is where we start to see the emergence of the image of Jesus that we're more familiar with today, right?
Yes, although it's important to note that even those early Byzantine or Roman depictions of Jesus varied considerably. There wasn't one definitive image that everyone agreed on.
So even within those early artistic traditions, there was diversity in how Jesus was represented.
Absolutely. And that diversity is something that's often overlooked when we focus solely on the dominant image of Jesus that emerged later on.
And speaking of diversity, what about the concept of a black Jesus? Because there are, in fact, black Jesus icons, particularly in Ethiopia and even Russia, which is fascinating.
It is fascinating. And it challenges the dominant narrative of a solely white Jesus, suggesting alternative ways of visualizing and understanding him within different cultural and theological contexts. These black Jesus icons often reflect the specific cultural traditions and beliefs of the communities that created them.
So the idea that Jesus could be depicted as black has existed for centuries.
Yes, and those depictions often carry deep symbolic and spiritual meaning within the communities that embrace them. They challenge us to think beyond the limitations of a single dominant image and to consider the multifaceted nature of faith and representation.
Okay, so we've got these diverse depictions of Jesus throughout history, but there's this one overarching question that keeps coming up for me. It has to do with Emperor Constantine. He played a huge role in spreading Christianity and making it the official religion of the Roman Empire. So did his influence, maybe even unintentionally, play a role in shaping the dominant image of Jesus that we see today?
That's a really complex question, and historians continue to debate it. Constantine's conversion and his subsequent support for Christianity undoubtedly had a profound impact on how the faith developed and spread. Whether his personal preferences or the prevailing artistic styles of the time contributed to a particular image of Jesus is still being discussed. What we do know is that after Constantine, Christianity became much more intertwined with political power, and that certainly had an influence on how the faith was represented and understood.
And it makes you wonder if that intertwining of Christianity with political power played a role in what some people call the whitewashing of Jesus.
That's a term that's been used to describe the process by which Jesus, who lived in the Middle East, was increasingly depicted as a white European.
And some argue that this whitewashing wasn't just an artistic choice, but served a purpose. Maybe to reinforce colonial narratives and establish a sense of European superiority.
It's a controversial idea, but one worth exploring. We have to remember that images aren't just neutral representations. They can be used to reinforce power structures and ideologies. The whitewashing of Jesus, intentional or not, might have contributed to the idea that European culture and Christianity were intertwined and superior to other cultures, thereby justifying colonial expansion and domination.
It's heavy stuff to think about, but it leads us right into some important theological debates happening today, right? There are folks grappling with the idea of Jesus' race and what it means for different Christian communities around the world.
Absolutely. There are theologians and scholars who are challenging traditional interpretations of Scripture and exploring how Jesus' potential non-whiteness impacts our understanding of his message and mission. It's a complex and evolving conversation, but one that's essential for the church to engage with in a meaningful way. It's a conversation that's long overdue, and it's connected to the whole idea of liberation theology, a movement that's been gaining traction, particularly in Latin America and among marginalized communities.
I've heard of liberation theology, but honestly, I don't know that much about it. What's the main idea behind it?
At its core, liberation theology seeks to reinterpret Christianity through the lens of the poor and oppressed. It challenges traditional power structures within the church and society as a whole, emphasizing the social and political dimensions of Jesus' teachings.
So it's not just about personal salvation, but about working for justice and liberation in here and now.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the systemic injustices that exist in the world and working to dismantle those systems, following the example of Jesus, who stood up for the marginalized and challenged the powerful.
And that brings us back to this whole discussion about the image of Jesus, right? If the dominant image has been used to reinforce power imbalances, then reclaiming a more accurate or diverse representation of Jesus becomes an act of resistance, even liberation.
Precisely. It's about reclaiming the narrative, challenging the assumptions that have been imposed on us, and reimagining Jesus in a way that aligns with our own experiences and identities.
And maybe that means going back to the Bible and looking at passages that challenge the traditional image. I'm thinking of the Song of Solomon, a book of poetry in the Old Testament that doesn't always get a lot of attention.
An often overlooked book, but incredibly relevant to this discussion. In Song of Solomon 5. Mir, for instance, the speaker describes her beloved as having hair like a raven, his locks are wavy black as a raven. And then in Song of Solomon 1.5, she says, I am black but lovely.
Okay, wow, those are powerful images. So we have this ancient love poetry that celebrates blackness and beauty. But what does that have to do with Jesus?
Well, interpretations vary, but some scholars believe that the Song of Solomon can be read allegorically, with the beloved representing Christ and the speaker representing the church or even individual believers.
So if we view it through that lens, it's possible to see those descriptions as challenging the idea of a solely white Jesus, even within the biblical text itself.
Precisely. Those passages open up the possibility of understanding Jesus as someone who might have shared physical characteristics with the people of the Song of Solomon who celebrated their blackness and beauty.
And that connection to the Song of Solomon also ties into the broader idea of challenging assumptions about race and beauty, right?
Yeah.
Like if blackness was celebrated in this ancient text, why has the dominant image of Jesus been so heavily influenced by European standards of beauty?
It's a crucial point to consider. Those assumptions about beauty, often intertwined with power dynamics and cultural dominance, have played a significant role in shaping how we view the world, including how we visualize religious figures. And unpacking those assumptions is essential if we're going to reclaim a more authentic and inclusive understanding of faith.
So where do we go from here? If we acknowledge that the traditional image of Jesus might be inaccurate or even harmful, what does that mean for Christianity? Especially in places like Africa, where the impact of colonialism is still felt so deeply.
That's where the idea of reclaiming Jesus becomes so powerful. It's about empowering communities to reimagine Jesus in a way that resonates with their own experiences, histories, and cultural understandings. And it's about recognizing that there isn't one right way to see or understand Jesus.
So it's not about erasing other depictions of Jesus, but about adding to the conversation, about recognizing the diversity of interpretations and representations that exist.
Exactly. It's about expanding our understanding of Jesus and recognizing that he can be seen and understood in multiple ways, each valid and meaningful within its own context.
Okay, so for someone listening to this and thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but what does it mean for me personally? What can I do? What would you say to them?
I'd say embrace the journey of exploration. Don't be afraid to question the narratives you've been given, to be open to different perspectives, and to engage with sources from diverse cultures and theological traditions. There's so much to discover, and the more we expand our understanding, the richer our faith becomes.
And maybe even think about how you picture Jesus and why. What influences your image? Is it based on tradition, personal experiences, or something else entirely? Taking the time to reflect on our own assumptions can be really eye-opening.
Absolutely. It's not about finding the right answer, but about engaging in a process of critical thinking and reflection, which can enrich our faith and our understanding of the world around us.
We've talked about history, theology, and even a bit of pop culture, but there's one more angle I think we need to touch on. The power of stories. Throughout history, people have used stories to understand the world, to grapple with big questions, and even to challenge the status quo.
Stories are incredibly powerful. They shape our perceptions and beliefs, often in ways we don't even realize. And when we talk about reclaiming Jesus, we're talking about reclaiming the power of storytelling too. It's about crafting new narratives, ones that resonate with the lived experiences of people who might not have always seen themselves reflected in the dominant Christian narrative.
So if the traditional story of Jesus has been used to exclude or even oppress certain groups, what kinds of stories can we tell to counter those narratives? What kinds of stories can we tell that embrace diversity, celebrate difference, and empower those who have been marginalized?
Those are the stories that need to be told. Stories that reimagine Jesus as a liberator, a champion of the poor, and oppress someone who stood in solidarity with those on the margins of society. Stories that challenge the status quo and envision a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued.
And those stories don't have to be confined to church or theological settings, right? Yeah. They can be woven into art, literature, music, all the ways we express ourselves and connect with the world around us.
Exactly. It's about infusing those themes of justice, equality, and liberation into all aspects of our lives, using creativity and storytelling to challenge the status quo and envision a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued.
It's powerful stuff to think about. So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, what's one takeaway you'd like to leave our listener with?
I think it's this. Don't be afraid to question, to challenge, to explore. Don't be afraid to dive deep into the stories that have shaped our world and to imagine new ones that reflect the kind of world we want to create.
A world where the image of Jesus truly reflects the richness and diversity of humanity, embracing all people in their fullness and complexity.
And that, my friend, is a story worth telling.
Yeah, it really is a story worth telling. And it connects back to that idea of liberation theology we were talking about, that idea of centering Jesus as a liberator, especially for those who have been marginalized or oppressed.
Exactly. If we're going to reclaim Jesus, we need to reclaim that liberatory aspect of his message, that call for justice and equality for all people. And that requires us to look at how Christianity has been used sometimes in harmful ways to support systems of power and oppression.
So we're talking about acknowledging that Christianity, like any religion, has been intertwined with politics and power throughout history. And that sometimes that's been used to justify things like colonialism, slavery, even discrimination against certain groups of people.
Precisely. It's a difficult but essential part of this conversation. If we want to genuinely reclaim Jesus, we need to grapple with the ways his message has been distorted or manipulated to serve agendas that are contrary to his teachings of love, compassion, and justice.
Yeah, it's like, how can we embrace the liberatory potential of Christianity while also acknowledging its complex and sometimes problematic history?
Well,
it feels like a bit of a paradox.
It is a paradox, but it's one that I think many people of faith are wrestling with today. It requires honesty, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions about religion, history, and power. And it means listening to those who have been harmed by the way Christianity has been used, healing their stories, and understanding how their experiences have shaped their perspectives on faith.
Yes, centering those voices, the voices of the marginalized, the oppressed, the forgotten, feels crucial if we're going to reclaim Jesus in a way that's authentic and transformative.
Yeah.
So what does that look like in practice? If someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, I want to be a part of this, but where do I even start? What would you say to them?
I would say start by seeking out those voices. Read books and articles written by theologians and scholars from diverse backgrounds. Listen to podcasts that feature conversations with people from marginalized communities. Engage with organizations that are working for social justice and liberation. Educate yourself about the history of Christianity and its relationship to colonialism, slavery, and other forms of oppression.
And maybe even take some time to reflect on how those historical forces have shaped your own understanding of faith, right? What assumptions have you inherited? What biases do you need to unlearn?
Those are all crucial parts of the journey. It's about being willing to do the work, to be uncomfortable, to challenge yourself, and to grow in your understanding of faith justice and the complex ways they intersect. It's not about arriving at a final destination, but about embracing the ongoing process of learning, unlearning, and relearning.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from biblical passages to historical events to theological debates. It's been quite a journey, but I think you've made it clear that this is just the beginning.
It is just the beginning. This conversation is ongoing, and it requires us to be continually engaged, questioning, and open to new insights. And ultimately, I think it's about love. Love for ourselves, love for our neighbors, love for all of humanity.
Yeah, that radical inclusivity, recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every person, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, or any other category that has been used to divide or marginalize, feels like it's at the heart of Jesus' message.
It is. And it's a message that continues to challenge and inspire us today, urging us to work towards a world where everyone can experience justice, equality, and the fullness of life that Jesus promised.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope you leave with a sense of curiosity, a thirst for knowledge, and a commitment to continuing this exploration.
Remember, reclaiming Jesus is a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly seeking, questioning, and striving to live out his teachings in a way that honors the diversity and beauty of all creation.
It's been an incredible deep dive, and I feel like I've learned so much. Thank you for sharing your insights and for encouraging us all to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep striving for a more just and compassionate world.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.